Hello class, I hope everyone is well. I'm excited to continue learning. This week we're going to be learning about respiration. So, I have a great video that helps explain respiration. I'll keep this link in our Google Classroom as always, so that we can watch this. I'd like you guys to start with this before going into the rest of this lecture. So let's get starting with the basics. Just like photosynthesis, I'm going to have you guys remember the basics, but I want to expose you and teach you the total, everything, the complex parts as well, in case you want to go on, or maybe you see this later in your school, and then you can have a jump start. So, the basics of respiration, as always, let's start with a definition. So respiration is the process which takes sugars and converts it into energy. So, as we can see, this is the opposite of photosynthesis. So photosynthesis usually always takes carbon dioxide and water and turns it into glucose and oxygen. So it's the exact opposite. Our overall reaction is C6H12O6 plus 6O2 goes into 6CO2 plus 6H2O. And if we look, again, another way to look at it compared to photosynthesis, it's the exact opposite. So our glucose is on the left side in respiration, it's on the right side in photosynthesis. Same with our oxygen, and then our carbon dioxide and water on the left side for photosynthesis, and they're on the right side for respiration. So it's quite beautiful, I think, how these two processes work so well. Without one, if the other would not work. If we didn't have oxygen for us to breathe from our plants that create that do photosynthesis and create oxygen, we would die. And if there wasn't CO2 produced by us or different things, then the plants would no longer have anything to eat. So it's quite interesting how that works. The important parts of the cell that we're going to talk about, in which the respiration process takes place, are first the cytoplasm, which is the liquid inside the cell. If we look at this animal cell, we have the cytoplasm pointed to this liquid. So we're going to talk about one step of respiration occurring in the cytoplasm, and the other and most important one is the mitochondria. So the mitochondria is also known as the powerhouse of the cell. It is here where most of our energy is created, which respiration's whole goal is to create energy. So most of respiration occurs in the mitochondria. Some important things, just like when we talked about in our photosynthesis lecture, there are a few energy carrying molecules or electron carrying molecules that work like batteries. So we have seen ATP before. When ATP is fully charged, we have 3 phosphates on it, and it's like our battery is brand new. When we lose a phosphate, we release all our energy from our battery, and now we have ADP at the bottom. And then if we want to charge up our battery, we just have to put some energy in, add a phosphate, and we're back to a fully charged ATP. The same works for NAD+, being our empty battery, and NADH being our full battery, and FAD+ and FADH2. So these are very important molecules as we go throughout our process, and we will be discussing them in a little bit more detail going forward. The major steps, so first of all, there's 2 major types of respiration. So there's aerobic respiration, which uses oxygen, is more efficient, and produces about 38 ATP. We have 3 main steps, which are glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain. And this is the type of respiration where we will spend most of our time, if not all our time, learning about and discussing. So Because it uses oxygen, we saw in our overall chemical equation that we need oxygen, and it's all about producing a lot of energy. So anaerobic produces a lot of energy. Our second type is, aerobic produces a lot. Anaerobic is our second type, which does not use oxygen, is inefficient, and only produces 2 ATP. So the steps that occur for our anaerobic respiration is just glycolysis. This shows a good example of how the processes work. We start with our carbohydrates or our glucose, and we come in and it can get converted into pyruvate and continue to the Krebs cycle, and then the electron transport chain like our aerobic respiration does. Or it can go down, and then if we don't have oxygen, it gets created into what's called lactic acid. So if any of you have ever been running or maybe playing soccer and your muscles, your legs or your arms hurt the next day, it's because of this lactic acid that gets built up. So when we're running, our muscles are using a lot of energy and oxygen. We get more oxygen when we breathe, but if we don't breathe fast enough, our body will naturally start to use anaerobic respiration because we aren't getting enough oxygen to our muscles. So that is this lactic acid buildup. If we have oxygen, our body will use aerobic, but sometimes we don't have enough, so we switch over to anaerobic. But aerobic is the best one, and we will be talking about that. So our first step is glycolysis. It is located in, it occurs, I should say, the location or where it occurs is our cytoplasm. So if we look back here even, glycolysis is outside of our mitochondria. This is our mitochondria, the rest of this is our cell, and glycolysis is out here in the cytoplasm. When we have glycolysis occur, we will have to put in 2 ATP, 2 things of energy, to convert our glucose molecule into 2 pyruvates. This really is splitting our 6-carbon molecule into 2 3-carbon molecules, but what we get back is 4 ATP. So we say that that is a net 2 ATP from glycolysis as a whole, because if you put in 2 and you get out 4, 4 minus 2 is 2, so our net is 2. In detail, this is the part where I just want to expose you guys to it. I don't expect you to know this at this detail. Our first step is glucose is converted into fructose 1,6-biphosphate. What that means is that a phosphate group, which looks like this, gets put on either end of our glucose molecule. And each time a phosphate molecule gets added, it takes that ATP. So that's where our 2 ATP are placed. So we have our phosphate groups, and then what happens is we break the chain. We break this into 2 3-carbon molecules, but then we want to add a phosphate group onto either side again. So what happens is, instead of using ATP, we are going to bring in NAD plus and a phosphate group and convert it into NADH plus and leave our phosphate group on here. So we're really replacing this hydrogen on the top with this phosphate group. And this hydrogen is going to go and charge our other battery, our other energy carrying molecule. This little 2x just means that we have 2 of them now. So we have 2 3-carbon molecules. Then how we get our ATP back, we need 4 ATP back. Each one of these phosphate groups that is now on is going to get removed. So since we're removing a phosphate group, we can go from ADP to ATP. So we produce 1 and 2 by removing the top molecule and the bottom phosphate group, I should say. The top phosphate group and the bottom phosphate group will give us ATP each time. And we can see that all the way over here too. We will get ATP as well. So When we end up at the very end, it is pyruvate. Oh, I probably should. It is pyruvate. So these steps, just to kind of explain what I just did, but that's where we can get our phosphate groups from. That's where we get our 4 ATP. 2 from this step from removing the top one, and 2 from removing the bottom one. And we have to input 2 ATP up here. And we also get our 2 NADH over here. So those are the important molecules to remember. At the end of glycolysis, we have 2 pyruvates. So our next step is our Krebs cycle. This is located in the matrix of the mitochondria. So our matrix of our mitochondria, if we look at this, it's a picture of our mitochondria. The very inside fluid is our matrix. So our pyruvate is going to come in right here, and it's going to go through a cycle called the citric acid or Krebs cycle. See, we can see that up here. It's the same name. I prefer Krebs, so we will be using Krebs cycle. And the input for this is our 2 pyruvate. Then we need 8 NAD pluses, 2 FAD pluses, and 2 ADP. So by looking at our inputs, we can picture that we're going to come out with 8 NADHs, 2 FADH2s, and 2 ATP, as well as 6 CO2. So this step is really all about creating our other energy carrying molecules, our NADH and our FADH2, which will get used later. And we see one of our major components get produced here, which is CO2. And this is all of what our CO2 comes from, is this step in the Krebs cycle. So, so let's stop there. That's how far we got on our first day in class. So this is step 2 in the Krebs cycle. We're gonna then tomorrow go through the details of the Krebs cycle, how it works, and finish up the electron transport chain.